大家好，今天咱们来录制认知科学这些重要概念的最后一步，是字母 M 开头到字母 Z 开头的。其中呢，今天有3个概念比较重要啊，一个是记忆，一个是模式识别，还有一个是表征。其中表征这个概念呢，贯穿了这本书从5个角度解读的这个5个角度，它全都涉及了，所以还是非常非常的重要，而且它应该也是认知科学里头的一个产出比较多的一个点。好，咱们来往下过。书中所有的概念呢，这些概念全都来自于这本书《Dictionary of Cognitive Science》。它解读的方向呢，实际上是神经科学、心理学、人工智能、语言学以及哲学。所以这本书如果有时间的话，大家还是需要去多多了解一下啊。它有很多概念解释都非常的全面。Memory. In cognitive psychology, the concept of memory pertains to mental states that carry information. Psychology research on memory has found evidence of a wide variety of mental representations and processes. Several distinctions are generally made in memory research, although recent theoretical advances relating to brain activation phenomena argue in favor of a structural unity that overarches this functional variety. The first distinction concerns the temporary or permanent nature of mental states. Short-term memory handles a limited amount of information and is particularly sensitive to any kind of interfering activity. This distinction resulted in the introduction of the concept of working memory, a transient kind of memory that accomplishes cognitive activities and whose role is contingent upon the temporal dimension of those activities and hence upon the necessary establishment of relationships between different pieces of information spread over time. Conceptions of long-term memory are also based on a number of distinctions. Tuving proposed the now classical opposition between episodic memory, or information that can be situated in time and space, and whose retrieval is context-independent, and semantic memory, or general knowledge of the world that is independent of the time and place where it was acquired, or whose retrieval is closely tied to its internal organization. Both of these forms of memory fall under the heading of declarative memory, knowledge that can be represented in natural language or in the form of mental images, and is therefore theoretically accessible to conscious awareness. Along with John Anderson's view, declarative memory is opposed here to procedural memory, which is involved in the accomplishment of perceptual motor or cognitive processes, and whose content remains essentially inaccessible. Still another, more recent opposition distinguishes explicit memory and implicit memory. Explicit memory relies on intentional information researching strategies, whereas implicit memory does not involve conscious access to information, but shows up in mental activities that use information incidentally encountered at an earlier time. In cognitive neuroscience, all feelings of familiarity and all activities involving the recognition or identification of a perceived object necessarily activate representations in memory. The nature of these representations and the mechanisms through which they are constructed and modified are important topics of study today. As has been done with other cognitive systems, memory can be divided into many functional subsystems. However, given the ever-present nature of memory and its tight links to perception, it is not surprising to find that it shares many neural and cognitive subsystems with the functional architectures of perception. Accordingly, the subsystems that store perceptual and semantic representations are also part of the functional subsystems of memory, supplementing the more specific subsystems. It is now widely acknowledged that human memory can be separated into different components, each of which can be selectively deteriorated by brain lesions. 下面一个是 mental imagery。mental imagery 实际上这个心理表象这个概念是 Coslin 以前这个研究完了并且推广的一个心理特征吧，算是。它还是衍生出了很多重要的一些研究吧，包括就是在体育运动领域，心理表象呢，实际上还是可以帮助到运动员在训练之后，躺在床上可以继续训练的。我不知道，就是有一些练舞蹈啊，或者说一些练其他这些就是动作特长的呃这些小伙伴们，是不是也了解这个心理表象这一个内容？大家可以去查一查。Mental imagery. The human mind retains traces of the sensory events it perceives. It is capable of evoking them in the form of inner experiences. These cognitive events, which are figurative in nature, are called mental images. The term mental imagery refers to the mechanisms by means of which individuals constructed internal representations that preserve the figurative aspects of objects, record them in memory, and then cognitively reinstate them in future situations. All sensory domains are concerned with mental imagery, but most of the work done so far has dealt with visual imagery. Visual mental imagery is not a single process. It is subtended by various subsystems, each specialized in specific cognitive operations. Identifying these subsystems has been a goal of many studies of brain damage to patient and tomography-based studies. As a whole, the findings support the view that visual mental imagery and visual perception share many functional subsystems. 下面一个是 metacognition。Metacognition, that is cognition about cognition, encompasses the knowledge and cognitive processes whose object is cognition and whose task is to control and verify one's own cognitive functioning. Two interdependent dimensions come into play: metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive experiences. Metacognitive knowledge, or meta-knowledge, is understood to be the set of knowledge and beliefs stored in long-term memory about factors likely to affect the progression and outcome of cognitive processes. Meta-knowledge pertains to persons, tasks, and strategies. Metacognitive experiences are understood to encompass all conscious cognitive or affective experiences linked to solving a particular problem. Such transient experiences occur especially when the subject is performing a relatively complex cognitive task that is complex for that particular subject's level of development or expertise that requires the implementation of control processes like planning, anticipation, and the assessment of strategies and/or outcomes. 下面一个是 modality。modality 这个概念呢，其实和 modularity 还是不太一样的，大家可以区分一下。Modality is the relation that links a proposition to an instance that grants its validity. According to this general definition, any stated proposition is therefore produced in a given modality. Although a reductionist conception of the relationships between morphology and semantics has led a number of authors to see as modalized only those propositions containing a marker specifically and exclusively aimed at expressing modality. In linguistics, the kind of modality to consider is the one that is displayed in a sentence. For example, in saying it's raining, the speaker is presenting a proposition as being objectively true at the moment the sentence is uttered, even if, based on non-linguistic considerations, we also know that this assertion is grounded in a belief or a perception of the speaking subject. 下面一个是 model 模型。Building a model of the normal cognitive system is the main goal of cognitive neuroscience. It is widely agreed today that cognitive activities like language and perception are not global, undifferentiated activities, and on the contrary, are made possible through the operation of multiple subsystems, each performing an elementary process. To build a model of cognitive functioning, one must identify these processes and define how the appropriate subsystems are organized and interrelated in order to accomplish a given cognitive operation. The model thus describes a set of subsystems organized into a functional architecture. However, such a model must abide by two fundamental principles: biological plausibility and computational suitability. First, the model must be consistent with our knowledge of the brain functioning. Second, the elementary processing steps taken by the different subsystems must be compatible with the results of a computational analysis, that is, a logical analysis that defines the processing steps any biological or artificial system must take to perform a given cognitive process. Only if the latter principle is obeyed will the description of the model be clear enough to be tested in a computerized simulation experiment. 所以是两个要求啊，一个是 biological plausibility，还有一个应该是 comply with the principle of computational analysis。那下面一个是 modularity。The term modularity in psychology refers to a conception of the cognitive system whereby it's divided into functionally distinct subsystems. The modular view of the cognitive activities is a critical one in neuroscience. In this view, mental activities are described as sets of subsystems or modules, each executing a particular information processing step. One of the goals of cognitive neuroscience is precisely to identify these modules, define their activity, and understand how they are organized into a functional architecture, a set of processing modules that carries out a given cognitive task. 下面是神经网络，大热大热、大红大紫的神经网络。The term neural network in cognitive neuroscience can be used to refer either to a computer simulation program in which interconnected units or artificial neurons work together to execute a particular calculation, or to a group of real neurons situated in one or more parts of the brain where the elementary cognitive operation is performed. Networks of artificial neurons, often called connectionist networks, are very useful for testing models of cognitive functioning. They help us understand how a system manages to produce a particular response when given a particular stimulus. An artificial neural net is made up of units, each of which has its own activity level. The units are interconnected, and each connection is assigned a weight that modulates the way two units interact. A network of this type is capable of storing information, and thus of learning. The stored information is contained in the connection weights, and learning consists of modifying the weights in order to improve system performance. Normativity. Normativity is the property of activities or states of affairs that makes them subject to rules and capable of being evaluated. Pattern recognition. 对于模式识别的这个定义也是有非常非常长的一个解释。这应该是我摘选的重要概念里头最长的一个解释了。大家可以一块来看一看啊，就是它是在很多学科都有非常强应用的。The overall goal of work on pattern recognition is to build automatic perception systems that are capable of identifying patterns collected by sensors, which act as sensory organs. Pattern recognition techniques are close to a number of other data processing methods, in particular data analysis, such as factor analysis, discriminant analysis, principal component analysis, etc., which attempts to transform and simplify pattern representation and data representation spaces, and automatic sorting, which takes a set of patterns or forms in the given representation space and tries to define a partition or set of classes. The standard pattern recognition system has three major components. First, there are sensing subcomponents, for example, microphones for speech, diode matrices for written character recognition, cameras for object recognition and sense, and pressure sensors, temperature gauges, and gas composition detectors to describe the state of an industrial installation, etc., that capture the pattern, filter it, and pre-process it to make it usable by a program. Next, a parameterization component extracts a relevant set of representative features from the pattern. For example, format frequencies for speech, a set of black and white dots for a printed character, lines representing the outline of an object in a picture. This stage reduces the amount of information carried by the pattern. And three, finally, a decision-making component identifies the pattern, assigns it to a class. This is done by comparing it to a set of prototype patterns incorporated into the system during prior learning phases based on a metric or distance defined in advance by the properties of the patterns processed so far. An important step in the development of a pattern recognition system is finding an adequate definition of how to represent the prototype patterns in a way that can account for the variability and diversity of the patterns studied, and guarantee a certain amount of immunity to noise that is liable to taint them. Two major families of methods have been used: structural and statistical. Structural or syntactic methods look at the structure of the patterns and describe them in terms of assemblies of primitive patterns. These methods are akin to formal language models and formal grammars. Statistical methods are based on statistical figures, such as means, standard deviations, that describe the patterns studied. Methods of the latter type are currently exhibiting the highest performance in various domains of application. Hidden Markov models are a good example and are now widely used in speech recognition and written character recognition. A variety of decision-making methods are employed, including Bayesian decisions, when an unknown pattern is classified in the category that incurs the lowest risk of error based on the probability distributions of the pattern classes, often approximated by Gaussian functions, sorting based on surfaces in the parameter space, or rather on hypersurfaces, which are analogous to mathematical surfaces for spaces of any dimension, where each region of the space delineated by the surfaces corresponds to a class. Nearest neighbor decisions, which assign an unknown pattern to the category of its nearest neighbors, whose class is known, with nearness being defined by the distance between the two patterns in the parameter space. And finally, classification by a connectionist of all neural network, where the necessary decision-making functions are learned by the network made up of interconnections between a large number of formal neurons designed to simulate the functioning of the brain. 下面一个重要概念是知觉啊，知觉其实能写出好几十本书来，所以我只摘了一个最基础的一部分概念啊，大家可以看一下。Perception is a process by means of which the organism becomes aware of its environment on the basis of information taken by its senses. 下面一个是 reason. Simplifying, one can say that to reason is to set a goal and imagine one or more means of reaching it. This process is extremely complex and necessitates the participation of many subsystems, including those involved in analyzing the situation perceptually, retrieving information from memory, and making decisions, not to speak of planning, controlling, and executing the response. Reasoning is often mediated by plans or solving procedures stored in memory. Such plans define a set of operations carried out by various processing subsystems, and the mechanisms that selects the plan is a critical part of the reasoning process. 下面一个是还原主义啊 ，reductionism, reducing a property or proposition in giving an explanation of it that shows its equivalence to another or several other more fundamental properties or propositions. 下面一个是表征 representation. It is no doubt regarding the concept of representation that psychology has had its most fruitful conceptual exchanges with other cognitive sciences. Exchanges across disciplines have also clearly brought out the distinction between representations as information-conveying structures and mediums that do not themselves carry any information but serve as the basis upon which representations are inscribed. The idea introduced here is that there are different mediums for different types of information, and that each medium imposes specific constraints on the information processing operations it supports. In this respect, the biological basis of cognitive representations is characterized both by its processing capacities and also by certain limitations in those capacities. All perceptual activity involving recognition, identification, or naming requires the activation of representations stored in memory. Stored representations also guide the execution of motor activities and mental image generation. It's hypothesized that representations contained in cortical neural networks are expressed in the form of patterns of weights assigned to connections between different units on the network. These patterns, or traces stored in memory, are thought to approximately correspond to neural activity patterns triggered by stimuli during perception. Recognition is possible when the activity pattern created by a perceived stimulus is able to activate a stored pattern via a matching mechanism. A field representation or memory trace is formed whenever a new stimulus is perceived, and the repeated perception of this stimulus contributes to consolidating the corresponding activation pattern in memory. Such representations, whose format is thought to match the activity pattern generated by the stimulus being perceived, are called perceptual representations. They seem to be stored in the same regions as those where the perceptual encoding of the stimulus occurred, and for this reason they are called modality-specific. The place where representation is stored is called a perceptual representation subsystem or a pattern activation subsystem, depending on the author. Perceptual representations are to be distinguished from other representations, called semantic representations, which are activated irrespective of the information intake modality. According to the above authors, semantic modal representations are stored in an associative memory subsystem. Links between representations are a fundamental feature of this subsystem and account for the organization of the semantic network. Semantic network is a knowledge representation structure in the form of a graph with nodes. The nodes correspond to objects, concepts, or events. They're connected to each other by arcs, which specify the relationships between them. This type of graph is finite, oriented, labeled, usually connected, and cyclical. 下面一个是符号学啊，符号学其实它是一个自然语言处理这个学科的一个就比较临近的一个姊妹学科，所以大家可以了解一下。References to semiotics in the cognition research are frequent, but they are generally oblique. We know that Charles Morris and Rudolf Carnap divided semiotics into syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And Chomsky and many other linguists took up this tripartite division, although their debates rarely refer to the semiotics that overarches the three parts. Yet semiotics is the very foundation of what is known as a symbolic paradigm in cognitive research. Moreover, with the recent upsurge of topics like multimodality and multimedia, semiotics have begun to attract more and more interest. Social cognition. Social cognition is the field of knowledge and know-how related to persons, to interpersonal relations between individuals, identified by the personal and functional characteristics as they interact with each other, directly or indirectly. Communication, mutual positioning, influence, to relations within a human group or among groups, and to social situations. This knowledge and know-how bears upon the emotions, affect, motives, and intentions that drive social agents, whether in a habitual way or in a particular circumstances. It also bears upon the processes of adjustment, influence, avoidance, and dissimulation. By directing their attention, it enables subjects to determine which of the many observable but often subtle behaviors manifested by other persons are useful cues for interpreting the events that take place in the human environment. 下面一个是 space. Psychological space encompasses the spatial properties of objects, including the body, and the spatial relationships between them. The cognitive psychology of space investigates the nature and the origin of the spatial knowledge needed to achieve mastery of the environment. Supervenience. Two of our most deep-rooted intuitions about mental phenomena seem to conflict. On one side, mental properties depend on physical properties, but on the other, mental properties cannot be reduced to physical properties. To reconcile these intuitions, philosophers of language proposed the concept of supervenience. This term goes back to the Aristotelian Latinus. It was used first in emergenist theories of evolution, and then in moral philosophy to express the idea that moral or evaluative properties, such as goodwill or courage, supervene on natural properties without being reduced to them. 下面一个是 thematic relation. The term thematic relation refers to the connection between the verbal predicate and each of its arguments. Each actant assumes a specific role in the predication. 好，这个就是整本书里头非常重要的一个概念，大家可以3个视频一起去看一下，我带大家一起就是浏览了一下这些重要的概念。这些概念呢，其实跟衍生出来的研究有不少，它应该是贯穿了不仅是认知科学这个学科，而且它还有贯穿了和认知科学相关的这5个上位学科的一些研究，所以非常非常的重要，希望大家喜欢。好，咱们这次就录制到这里，谢谢大家，再见。